Welcome to the NCCN Global Policy Webinar Series, Understanding the Global Challenges to Equitable, High-Quality Cancer Care. My name is Robert Carlson, and I am the Chief Executive Officer at the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month, a time when we celebrate advances in childhood cancer treatment and survivorship care, and bring awareness to policy and advocacy challenges for pediatric cancer care around the world. This session showcases the commitment of physicians, patient advocates, and caregivers as they work towards providing equitable access to high-quality pediatric cancer care. NCCN is a not-for-profit alliance of 32 leading academic cancer centers dedicated to improving and facilitating quality, effective, equitable, and accessible cancer care. Through the leadership and expertise of clinical professionals at NCCN member institutions, NCCN develops resources that present valuable information to numerous stakeholders in the healthcare delivery system. NCCN guidelines and clinical content is utilized throughout the world. Of our 1.5 million registered users, nearly half are located outside the United States. As you can see from this map, NCCN content is downloaded in nearly every country around the world. Historically, most children with cancer in the United States have been included in active clinical trials. With improved cure rates and decreased research funding, more patients are being treated outside of clinical trials. The NCCN guidelines for pediatric cancers are intended to ensure management is provided in the best possible manner to improve both short and long-term outcomes for pediatric patient populations. NCCN, in collaboration with the African Cancer Coalition, American Cancer Society, and Clinton Health Access Initiative, has developed NCCN harmonized guidelines for Sub-Saharan Africa. As part of this initiative, African oncologists identified the need for pediatric resource-appropriate treatment guidelines for their region. The collaboration has published harmonized guidelines focused on pediatric ALL, and other pediatric guidelines are in development. The NCCN guidelines for patients are patient-friendly adaptations of the NCCN clinical guidelines. They are formatted to help individuals with cancer, as well as caregivers and family members, talk with their physicians about the best treatment options for their disease. The patient guidelines are offered free of charge online and using the NCCN mobile app. We currently have patient guidelines covering pediatric acute lymphoblastic leukemia and adolescents and young adults with cancer. NCCN appreciates and recognizes the supporters and sponsors of this webinar series. Without your support, this webinar would not be possible. Thank you. Today's program will focus on equitable access to critical diagnostic, treatment, and supportive care for pediatric patients globally. The program will begin with a pre-recorded presentation from Dr. Emanuela Amwako, highlighting the challenges and importance of pediatric oncology clinical trials in Africa. Dr. Amwako will join us live to answer any questions you may have. Finally, we will host a live panel discussion that will focus on the complexities of pediatric oncology from various perspectives and ways to promote equitable access to pediatric care, as well as improve the lives of pediatric caregivers and others. Our moderator for today's webinar is Dr. Weijin Ko. Dr. Ko is Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at NCCN and oversees the NCCN clinical practice guidelines in oncology. At this time, allow me to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Emanuela Amwako is a pediatric oncology fellow at Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital in Accra, Ghana, as well as the head of clinical affairs at Yamachi Biotech. She graduated from Luhansk State Medical University, Ukraine, in 2012. Dr. Amwako is the secretary of the Childhood Cancer Society of Ghana and established an oncology shared care unit at the Cape Coast Teaching Hospital in 2019. We are thrilled that Dr. Amwako is here with us today to share her expertise. Her presentation has been pre-recorded, but we welcome the opportunity to answer your questions in the live session following her presentation. We look forward to an active conversation today and welcome your questions and engagement throughout the program.
Hello, everyone. I'm Emanuela Mwaku, a pediatric oncology fellow at Equitable Teaching Hospital in Accra, Ghana. And I'm also the Director of Clinical Affairs at Yemachi Biotech, which is a private cancer research company in Ghana. Today, we'll be talking about the need to increase access to pediatric oncology clinical trials in Sub-Saharan Africa. This is the outline of my presentation. We're going to be talking about why clinical trials are important, why inclusion is important, and the way forward. Now, globally, about 400,000 cases of childhood cancers are diagnosed each year. Most of these cases occur in low and middle income countries. However, high income countries record as high as 80% survival rates, whilst low and middle income countries record as low as 20% survival. The Global Initiative for Childhood Cancer hopes to achieve at least 60% survival by 2030. Even though this figure looks good from where we are now, it's still lower than what is currently being seen in high-income countries. I'll tell you a story about two children, about Ellie, who was born in the UK, and Ella, who was born in Ghana. Now, Ellie was diagnosed with rhabdomyosarcoma of the thigh, and at presentation, she had stage 4 disease. Because she was living in the UK at the time of her diagnosis, she had cytogenetics and molecular tests done on her cancer. And she was given treatments that were specific to the kind of mutations that she had. Now, 4 years down the line, Ellie remains in remission, and she started medical school earlier this year. Now, this is the ideal cancer patient's journey, where a patient will present with symptoms, no matter how late they are to the hospital, and they have diagnostics done, which are not limited. Most of them might have molecular testing, they might have cytogenetics done, and then most will be enrolled in clinical trials and offered targeted therapy specific to the kind of mutations in the cancer. All of these improve survival rates in these countries. Now I'll tell you about a story about Ella, who was born in Ghana. Ella was 5 years old when she was diagnosed with rhabdomyosarcoma of the leg. At presentation, she had stage 2 disease. Ella, however, didn't have access to molecular diagnosis and cytogenetics. Her diagnosis was based on histopathology and immunohistochemistry. Ella was treated with adapted protocols from modified protocols that are used in Europe. These protocols were developed as a result of clinical trials in children that were primarily Caucasian. Unfortunately, 2 years down the line, Ella's disease spread and she's dead now. Sadly, this is the story of a patient in Sub-Saharan Africa. And when patients present with symptoms, they might present for alternative treatment in different places before going to the hospital. At the time of presentation, some of them may have advanced diseases. And even when they present with early diseases like Ella did, most of them don't have access to genetic testing and molecular tests. And so they will be given treatments based on foreign protocols, which are not specific to their disease. And all of these cause survival rates to be low in Sub-Saharan Africa. Why are we so keen about clinical trials? And why are we talking about clinical trials in African children? This is because clinical trials have been shown to improve outcomes. And this is one of many studies that has proven that. In this study done in 2017, where they compared children that were on the UK ALO protocol 2003 to patients who were not in the trial, they saw up to 17% 2-year relative survival compared in those in the trial compared to those that were not in the trial. Now, global research databases are very non-diverse, and almost 80% available GWAS data is derived from Caucasian individuals, compared to 2.4% from people of African descent. The NCI database is similarly skewed, and less than 2% of clinical trial participants are Black. All of these result in a situation where precision oncology tools perform less optimally in people of African descent. And this map further illustrates the inequity in clinical trial distribution, with over 70% of clinical trials being performed in North America and Europe. Now, if we delve into pediatric oncology trials, this study that was done in 2020 and that looked at records of clinical trials saw that amongst all the clinical trial records, which was about 73,000, that included patients aged 0 to 65 years, only 105 of these trials occurred for children with cancer in Africa. So only 105 trials included children with cancer from Africa. And sadly, only 0.07% of these trials were interventional trials. And the reason why we keep insisting that the African child should be included in clinical trials is because studies have shown that ethnicity is associated with divergent outcomes, and there are racial disparities when it comes to survival and even treatment response, depending on genetics of patients. Now, this study by Pollock and et al. Compared the survival of cancer patients with different ethnicities based on their tumor biology. And in this study, it showed that Caucasian patients had consistently better outcomes than African Americans with similar tumor biology. And one of the reasons why we should not exclude African children from clinical trials is because it's our ethical obligation to make sure that every single child has access to care, regardless of where they are born. And NCCN guidelines also states that clinical trials are the best standard of care for care of people with cancer. So away from ethical obligations and standards of care, science has also proven that the African population is the most genetically diverse in the world, with 99% of human evolutionary history occurring in Africa and 300,000 years of human genetic history. The African genome contains approximately 10% of novel DNA. And this map shows that Africa has the most genetic variability. This means that Africa is the key to understanding the genetic basis of many diseases, and the cure for the African child will be the cure for the children of the world. Now, what are some of the barriers that we face in Sub-Saharan Africa to clinical trials? One of the barriers we face is infrastructure. There's little or no access in some countries to molecular or genetic diagnosis, and there is even limited supportive care that most patients will require when they are in clinical trials. There's also lack of adequate skilled human resource, and this is even made worse by brain drain that is occurring now. And when it comes to logistics, there's lack of steady flow of medications, and sometimes most sponsors are not even willing to ship to Africa. One of the other issues is the IRB concerns. Africa has 54 countries, and it means that having a clinical trial in Africa would mean that getting ethical approval from 54 different countries. Funding is also a major issue, with most of the funding for research coming from overseas. So the sponsors have the right to dictate what research would be done. And most of them focus on infectious disease rather than childhood cancers. It's even made worse by the fact that most African governments spend less than 1% on research and development. Also, when most children are placed in clinical trials, their supportive care is being handled by insurance. But in Africa, or in Sub-Saharan Africa, most of insurance companies would not cover this. This makes it even worse for the African child. There's a general lack of trust towards trials by people of African descent, and this stems from past experiences. Most national cancer disease, most African national cancer control programs do not even prioritize childhood cancers. All of these makes it very difficult to run trials in Africa. However, wherever there's a problem, there is a solution. And there are things that we can do to improve outcomes. One of the things that we can do is to increase awareness, making sure that people think cancer, because sometimes even making a diagnosis of cancer is difficult. And in my country, Ghana, for example, we are going on a campaign training primary healthcare workers and even individuals of the community to be able to identify early warning signs of childhood cancers. We can improve access to these children by creating shared care centers where they can receive some supportive treatment and basic chemotherapy. We can also have collaboration, twinning programs between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. These institutions would foster training and then help low and middle-income, the institutions will help low and middle-income countries to be able to run clinical trials. We should also be able to optimize diagnosis and treatment for clinical trials. And this is why I work with Yemachi Biotech, which is a private cancer research company in Ghana that offers molecular and genetic testing currently. We can also start small and then scale up by starting with non-interventional clinical trials, getting that expertise, and then scaling up to interventional clinical trials. You might think that these might be difficult to achieve, but the Global Initiative for Childhood Cancer, which is an initiative by WHO, offers a ray of hope. And they hope to increase survival by at least 60% by 2030. They hope to do this on national, regional, and global levels. And there will be a collaboration between centers and training between centers to offer excellent care for children with childhood cancers. Now, in conclusion, clinical trials improve patient outcomes, and Africa has the most genetically diverse population. And we should remember that the cure for the African child will be the cure for all. I'll leave us with this paragraph. The conspicuous absence of African children from cancer trials highlights the global disparities that exist in cancer research and care. This disparity must be addressed if the WHO Global Initiative for Childhood Cancers is to achieve its goal of at least 60% survival for all children with cancer by 2030. This would not be an easy task, but the battle against childhood cancers will be fought in Africa, and it's not one the world can afford to lose. These are my references, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omoko, for that inspiring presentation that raises the challenges and opportunities to all of us. We're going to have about a 10-minute Q&A session with Dr. Omwako. For those of you who have questions, could you please enter that in the Q&A box, and we will try to get through as many of these questions as possible. So perhaps if I can start with a couple of questions for you, Dr. Omwako. You talk about cooperation and help both ways, and we want to emphasize, I think, it's not just a one-way help. It's a cure of the African child will lead to improved care and cancer outcomes throughout the world. But what do you see as specific steps? You mentioned training, but are there other areas of cooperation between high and low and middle income countries that could be done now and that could be used to increase access to pediatric cancer trials and care in Africa?
Right. Thank you very much. A great question. Apart from building local capacity, such as training healthcare workers and training people who can lead clinical trials. There can also be technological tech transfer between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries, training programs such as collaborations between institutions in high-income countries and those in low and middle-income countries, such that when there is a clinical trial for childhood cancers, institutions in high-income countries should have their data diverse by including children from Sub-Saharan Africa. Funding for pilot studies. Funding again is both ways, right? So from our governments, they must take responsibility to make sure that a good percentage of their GDP is put into research and development. Also, if we are able to create bio repositories, it would help such that there's some baseline data that everyone has access to, and then they know what exactly what they're looking for. So these are some of the things that can improve access. And one of the other things is good policy. I'll use my country, Ghana, for example. Just quite recently, we 4 childhood cancers were included in the National Health Insurance, and it is improving access because most people do not even present to the hospital because they can't afford cancer care. Mostly is out of pocket, and by putting some of these childhood cancers on the National Health Insurance scheme, more people do present to hospital early, and we are able to see them and diagnose them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, impressed with the amount of work that you do. You're a pediatric oncology fellow, and you're also the director of clinical affairs at Yamachi Biotechnology. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work with Yamachi Biotechnology? I understand it's focused on diagnostics, molecular diagnostics, and how you incorporating that into your training and practice, and how you try to bring that into broader use in Ghana and beyond.
Right. So Yamachi Biotech is a cancer research company, as I mentioned. It's private. Most of the funding is from investors and money that was raised by the founders. The work we do here is to understand cancer, like molecular level cytogenetics, that affects people of African descent. This again because as I mentioned earlier, the African genome is quite diverse, and there are certain mutations that might be present in people of African descent that might not be present in people who are not of African descent. What Yamachi seeks to do, or the work I do at Yamachi, is to collaborate with clinicians and those who are interested in research and want to understand what is going on with their patients. Again, Compared to other ethnicities, Africans tend to have the worst kind of disease. And I mean, sometimes we think it's disease, maybe it's medications, or maybe it's just because people present late. But like the child I presented earlier, she presented with stage 2 disease and still didn't make it. Her disease only got worse. So at Inequities, we try to understand this, and I work with clinicians from different specialties to understand this. And with pediatric oncology, we hope to understand what drives the genetic basis of childhood cancers in Ghana. And it's a project that we hope to start soon with colleagues in various pediatric oncology sites in Ghana.
Is the work in Inequities focused completely on research, which is obviously very important, or is this something that you are trying to advance into broader clinical care? Now, you have pointed out that we certainly need much more specific information in the African pediatric population, but there are increased signals, if you will, of biomarker-driven therapy, globally. And are you able to bring this into broader clinical use while also advancing research and a clinical database?
Yeah. Again, it's something that we seek to do, and with some of the programs or some of the studies that we're doing currently, we're actually providing diagnostics to the patients, molecular diagnostics to the patients that were previously not available. We're able to do them. And even though it's on the research level, clinicians can use it to make decisions because our lab is approved by the regulatory bodies here. And so we offer diagnostic tests, and thankfully these patients get to have it for free because we are doing it like research, but the clinicians are able to reach out to us, and these patients have these diagnoses for free, and it does help in their care for cancer.
That's great. You had mentioned that there are multiple, elements that are required to advance pediatric cancer care. Now, one of the elements beyond funding, beyond research and infrastructure is community trust and engagement. You talk about how Ella, I believe, could have sought alternative approaches before entering the healthcare system. How are you, even as you're trying to improve the infrastructure and the research foundation, how are you and others trying to engage the community to educate the population so that they are aware of the opportunities of care?
All right. We do a lot of advocacy, we do a lot of awareness, go on TV, radios to make people understand what childhood cancers are, and hope that they present when they should. Now, because there are not very many clinical trials that are available on the continent, we don't really talk to them about that because it's not available. Like, you talk about it, but you can't enroll anybody into it. There are also patients that have approached clinicians. Caregivers have approached clinicians to talk. Maybe the child has a certain disease. They actually read on it, and most patients will come. I've read about St. Jude's. Can you refer me to St. Jude's? They have a fair idea that this is a research center. Clinical trials do take place there. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to what's the word? It's a little difficult to reach their criteria to be able to transfer patients to these centers. But yeah, some patients are aware, and we're doing a lot of awareness to make people understand. And when there's an opportunity like the African Wilms Tumor Collaborative Trial, we do talk to our patients, and then most of the Wilms tumor patients actually that are on treatment currently are under this collaborative trial. So yeah.
Great. One I don't see any questions right now in the Q&A, but there'll be more opportunities to ask questions of Dr. Moko when we go to the panel discussion. But you've raised, the challenges and opportunities. Are you able to share perhaps one example? You mentioned start small and grow the opportunity. Are you able to share an example during your time or otherwise where there was success achieved through this collaboration?
Right, before my time. So before my time, in the 2000s, the early 2000s, there was the African Burkitt's clinical trial that sought to change from one chemotherapy regimen to 3 drugs. The study was done in Malawi, Cameroon, and Ghana, and there was a really good improvement and increased survival rate in stage 1 and 2 Burkitt's patients. And currently, based on that trial that happened in Africa, it's sort of advised the treatment for Burkitt's in most countries currently. And this just makes sense because the burden of disease is here. You would see all sorts of variations here. And when you start trials like this in this part of the continent, in this part of the world, then you would be able to base treatments on the results that you have from here. And then in my time, the African Wombs Tumor Collaborative Trial that is being done currently in Malawi and Ghana. I think, I remember Malawi and Ghana. And the 1 year event-free survival in these patients increased from 52% to 68%. And because of this trial, the abandonment rate reduced from 23% to 12%. That's like half of it. And the patients seem to be doing okay. And the African Wombs Tumor Collaborative Trial it's just using adapted protocols in these patients with drugs that are already used and already available. But the fact that it's in a clinical trial setting and these patients have access to care, the surgery is being paid for, they have access to diagnosis, it retains them in the programs and they tend to come and then complete treatment and they do well after that. So yes, we start small and then we can aim high for molecular targeted therapies in these patients. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you for your leadership, and we look forward to further advances coming out of your work and the research efforts in Africa. So joining Dr. Mwako is Dr. Flalagi from St. Jude's, Ms. Alejandra Martinez from Chile, and Ms. Bindu Nair from India. So if Dr. Flalagi could start us off, perhaps give us a few brief introductory statements, what you do, and why you find yourself on this policy panel.
Thank you so much. So yes, as you mentioned, my name is Dr. Jamie Flalagi, and I'm one of the pediatric oncologists here in Memphis, Tennessee at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. I'm part of our division of leukemia lymphoma, and how I found my way to this panel is that international application of findings for childhood cancer has been a focus of my personal life, my passion, and my research. I have become a disease expert in Hodgkin lymphoma, and not because I have a fascination with Reed-Sternberg cells or the disease, but because of the international application we can have of our results, because it is such a curable disease, we can truly cure it no matter where a child presents around the globe. So that's where I found myself. I've had the absolute pleasure of being the panel chair for the NCCN guidelines for pediatric Hodgkin lymphoma, and I look forward to next steps to make harmonized guidelines in Sub-Saharan Africa upcoming, which I'll speak to in a bit, to really share what we've done and try to make a difference for everybody. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mendez.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Alejandra Mendez, the mother of a childhood cancer survivor. After that experience, I decided to devote myself to giving every child who's diagnosed with cancer the same opportunity to survive this disease. I'm currently Vice President and Board Member of Fundación Nuestros Hijos in Chile. I'm Board of Trustees at the CCI, Childhood Cancer International, member of the COPAR Committee, that's a program for advancing research capacity for pediatric cancer clinical trials. I'm representing the interests of childhood cancer survivors and parents. I'm also advisor to the LATAM group of childhood cancer survivors, Faros de Vida. For me, healthcare is a right, not a privilege. A right enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child. But unfortunately, most childhood cancers, fortunately, most childhood cancers, we know that they do not have a known cause. So they're impossible to prevent, but they can be treated and cured. But for some children living in low, medium income countries, the health workers, the drugs, the equipment they need are in very short supply. They're only available at selected few hospitals where high quality treatment is hard to come by. So it's a situation that drives a disparity in care, and thousands of preventable deaths can be prevented every year.
Thank you very much, Mendez. And Ms. Naik.
Hi, I'm Bindu, and good evening and good afternoon. Cancer in India. I'm based in the south of India, but my organization actually works all across India, supporting around 4,000 children with cancer right now. And I am also in the, I'm not a parent, or fortunately I have no connection to childhood cancer other than the fact that somehow I was brought into this field, and I very passionately work in this field also. And I am also an executive board member of the Childhood Cancer International and co-chair for the Global Health Network Working Group PFSC. And I'm also in the steering committee of ARIA. I think I will talk in detail about the work in India that we do later. And I guess these are the reasons I found myself here. But thank you so much for the invite. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here. So if I can direct the first question to Ms. Mendez and Ms. Nair. Could you tell us a little bit more about your organizations and how your organizations may be supporting advocacy and policy efforts within your respective regions, say Latin America or in Asia, and we recognize that while pediatric cancer is a global issue, there are unique needs and challenges regionally. So, Ms. Mendez, what is your organization doing? You talked about your personal call, but what's your organization doing to advance policy and advocacy in your region?
So we're an organization that was created 30 years ago in 1991. Our purpose is supporting children and families diagnosed with cancer. We want everybody to face childhood cancer in all the dimensions, so that every child has the same opportunity to live the disease with dignity, to be treated, to recover, and to be included into society after treatment. So we believe that every child must have the same opportunities to overcome the disease, regardless of his or her socioeconomic background. So we provide children with cancer and their families support to increase their life expectancy, improve their quality of life, and of course, decrease the psychosocial impact of the disease. So we complement and improve existing services through a variety of social and medical programs, as well as educational programs, research initiatives, and social reintegration programs. So we have the only rehabilitation center for after treatment long-term side effects, the only one in all Latin America. Is run by Fundación Nuestros Hijos. We have in-hospital schools. We have home-away homes, including some isolation units. We have medical and social programs that are not covered by the state. We have at-home palliative care services, and we also provide psychological support. So our mission is making childhood cancer a national health priority. We shape policy, we support research, we raise awareness, and we provide educational resources and innovative programs to children with cancers survivors, and their families. We are leaders in Latin America, and we are currently exporting our models to other Latin American countries, enhancing the impact we have in fighting childhood cancer.
It's wonderful. Ms. Nair, how about your organization and your personal efforts in India and perhaps in the broader Asia region?
Thank you. So as you might know, India leads with the largest number of childhood cancer cases in the world, 50,000 to 60,000 new cases per year, and less than 200 pediatric oncologists in India, because pediatric oncology is a very emerging field in India. So it's mostly the children are treated by medical oncologists, and only the tertiary care centers are treating pediatric oncology in India. Though we don't have universal healthcare now, we do have very good insurance policy of the central government, which gives free treatment to all the economically backward people, which covers the childhood cancer also. But the problem is the number and the existing infrastructure don't match. And because it's only available in the tertiary care centers from the remote villages, for the people to realize that this is childhood cancer and then reach the center takes time. Though there is accessibility to the treatment, lack of awareness prevent them from reaching the center on time. So organizations like ours, mine, and other organizations, what we try to do is bridge that gap. Wherever the government is falling short, we are trying to bridge the gap. So because all the government hospitals, I'm sure you know that we have a public and a private healthcare sector actually. And the private healthcare sector is very, very expensive. But because the public healthcare system can't support all the childhood cancer patients, the parents at some point will be forced to come to the private sector where it's very expensive. So we support there also for medical treatment. And another thing that after the government hospitals salaried by us. So we give and the pediatric oncology departments of enhance the performance of the hospitals. So these salaries are paid by us. So we go into an MOU with the hospital and we place the staff inside so that the doctors have a support system there to work with. Have a medical advisor who himself is a very senior pediatric oncologist. So we put forward some criteria when we give staff. So we have a say in which protocol is used and how the entire department is working when it comes to treating childhood. We are trying to bring a standardized kind of treatment in all the centers that we are involved with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The connection may have faded out a little bit, but and you may have addressed this, but how much does your organization, because you talk about the public-private differences, how much does your organization interact with policymakers to, broaden access to care and to research?
That is a very difficult question to answer because we have state policies and then a central policy. So state policy makers, we interact on a very closer level, may not be on all the states, but most of the states where we can actually access the policy makers. Central government's policy makers access is not that easy. It is easier to act, closely with the state policymakers. Yeah, we get a chance to do that. And there are changes that we bring also because all these government hospitals come under the state policy makers administrative power. Because of that, we get access to them, if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. I'm going to transfer over to Dr. Floragi. You, as you mentioned, come from St. Jude's, and you've been the leader of the Pediatric Hodgkin's panel. St. Jude's obviously has been a leader in global pediatric cancer efforts. So can you tell us a little bit more about St. Jude's partnership with Pediatric Cancer Program Worldwide, your involvement or St. Jude involvement in the WHO Cancer Initiative that Dr. Marco mentioned. And you know, it was kind of alluded to a couple of times, an ARIA program that if you want could expand on that a little bit more.
Thank you so much, and I would absolutely love to. So I'm grateful to work at a place that has really invested both with personnel as well as finances outside of the US and truly have a global presence and are trying to do what we are doing here, which is cure kids with cancer, just like everybody is, and work on how do we do that better together. So also trying to make sure that that presence is collaborative and working with all the initiatives like we've already heard and do it together. So two things. One, guidelines are super important. Just touching on that for a moment, as Dr. Amuako mentioned, you know, truly treating patients with the current standard of care or whatever is the most recent standard of care makes a difference. And so the ARIA guidelines, which are the Adapted Resource Implementation Application effort, truly is trying to make guidelines for every disease across the world. The guidelines are resource adapted because if you, for instance, don't have a PET scanner, then it does not help to know how you treat patients with response adaptation according to a PET. So they also need to be in the context of available resources in many different settings. This makes them lengthy. So some of the guidelines are between 50 and 200 pages. And so one other thing that they've been doing is making a novel web-based platform. So guidelines are important. They need to be made. They also need to be able to be followed in an easy manner. And when doing it for many different diseases, it's hard to be a disease expert in everything on the treating end. So what the novel platform is also helping to do is take the guidelines and apply them to your patient. There's a tool to help with staging, with treatment options, with dosing, etc. So really taking and making a tool to help implement the guidelines in a very productive and easy manner, no matter where you are. Of course, a guideline is only as good as being able to provide the drugs and access to whatever is in the guideline. And so drug access is a huge piece. So for successful treatment of patients, I like to give the example from here in the US, we are not immune to drug access issues. On a trial we had here that we ran at St. Jude, for instance, nitrogen mustard, or what's called mechlorethamine, became unavailable. Cyclophosphamide, a drug that is thought to be as equally efficacious, was substituted. And the event-free survival fell by 13% just from that change. And we still had availability to access for drugs. So a guideline in treatment is only as good as being able to follow it without delays and without substitutions or dropping drugs, again, as Dr. Amuako mentioned. So St. Jude, and I'm very proud to say, has partnered with the WHO and helped fund the drug access program. We've committed over $200 million to help fund childhood cancer drug availability globally. This is only the first step. It is important to make drugs safe, to make drugs accurate. And so whatever the drug says is what it is, as well as make drugs available with regularity across the globe. And so it's not just providing funds to get the drug, it's trying to stabilize drug access in the drug market and really move drug availability for the key set of agents that can make a difference in the world forward. So they're about 9 months into this process. They're going to pilot with 5 or 6 countries soon. And so it really was the next important step. We can have guidelines. They're only as good as implementing them, and that's the novel tool. And then you have to be able to have the drugs to actually access that. And so that's step 2, which was the partnership with the WHO. So we're really excited. And, you know, it's just step 1. We'll learn along the way, and there may be changes we have to make too, but it's an exciting first step.
So thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership in part of that effort. Moving to Dr. Mwako, there were a couple of questions that were asked by an audience member. You mentioned the importance of advancing, promoting clinical research in Africa. This question, the questioner raised two sort of related issues here. Is Sub-Saharan Africa, how ready is Sub-Saharan Africa ready for cancer clinical trials, given the level of regulatory support that might be available there? For example, you know, within the United States, there's FDA, and in European, there's the European Medicines Organization. What sort of infrastructure support is required, or is that already available? You mentioned trials that have been done in Ghana, Malawi. And the follow-up question is, what is your confidence? I mean, certainly there's no question about the need, but how about your confidence based on the human resources and expertise that are already available to carry out these trials? You talked about the need for training and the availability of personnel. So those two linked questions to you, Dr. Marco.
Thank you very much. Those are good questions. How ready is Sub-Saharan Africa for clinical trials? I mean, just looking at it from the top, you'd probably say that we are not ready because, of course, limited resources and supportive care. It's probably not always available, but we can't always base on that, like always saying that we are not ready and then we never start, right? As I mentioned, we are doing some observational trials currently, and that is training people to understand what clinical trials are like. And alongside doing this, we can build up infrastructure that is required. A few African countries are able to actually provide molecular and cytogenetic testing. They are there. Collaborative efforts on the continent can help improve that. So maybe if, let's say, a country close to Ghana cannot offer certain tests, and there's a facility in Ghana that can offer this test, then these countries or these institutions can collaborate, and the test is done here. And then with the clinical trials, maybe look at the areas where we do have the most supportive care available. And like South Africa is able to carry out clinical trials. There are certain clinical trials that happen in other countries in Africa. Maybe look at this and build upon them whilst trying to build in various African countries. And human resource expertise, of course, it's never enough, but there are people. And if we have to make this work, we have to make sure we actually look and evaluate the kind of capacity that is there. Not always like sort of bring in people, but look at those people who are on the ground, who are doing work, and then improve or help them do it better. And so, yeah, you might look at it like in my country, we have 6 pediatric oncologists. You might say, oh, we're probably not ready for clinical trials, but there are people that are being trained in the country. There are people that are not clinical oncologists, but everybody doesn't have to be the PI, right? They are co-investigators, they are study nurses, they are people who do other things during the trial. And so making sure that it can be done with those that are available whilst trying to train the next generation is very, very important. If not, we are always going to sit down and say we are not ready for clinical trials. We can't always wait for everything to be full force before initiating these trials. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marco. And you raised a really good point. I've had the privilege of going to Africa several times to work with our Sub-Saharan African colleagues. And it's not a lack of knowledge. The clinicians in Sub-Saharan Africa know the information, know what to do. The barriers are more in terms of the resources. And if the resources are provided, the knowledge and certainly the willingness and initiative is there. A question to each one of you in turn. We'll see who is brave enough to start with this. On the call today are members of pharmaceutical companies, and we know that they are a large part of the oncology ecosystem. Dr. Falagi mentioned that even for commonly used medications, there are availability issues, and that is probably magnified with some of the newer and precision medications. So maybe I'll do this in alphabetical order, so it's not to pick on anyone. So Dr. Marco, you're up first. If you had some wishes, requests, advice for pharma as to how they can become engaged in clinical research and in the advancement of pediatric oncology care, what would you say?
I would want to ask them not to forget the children. I know that profit making in childhood cancers or generally children is maybe very little, but they are also important in their future. They could help with regulation, making sure that there's quality drugs available and then availability. And pharma companies can come together and form maybe an alliance. Like for vaccines, there's the Gavi Alliance, and this is made up of different pharma companies that came together to provide certain vaccines at subsidized prices for people in low and middle income countries. If this can be done for vaccines, this can be done for childhood cancers. And making sure that there's good quality control and to work with initiatives as Dr. Fedra mentioned, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, maybe work with them to make sure that they provide quality and make drugs affordable to children in Africa. Thank you.
That's great. Over to you, Dr. Flagger. You've obviously already seen Jude has engaged with pharma companies in some of your initiatives to provide medication. You mentioned guidelines, but also availability. So what are your thoughts and advice and suggestions to pharma?
Yeah, I actually have a couple. And one, I just want to start by thanking them. Although we could always use increased drug support to make drugs available everywhere, I'd say in general, pharma has done an increasing job at supporting pediatric trials. So through a lot of different legislation that's gone through, we're getting earlier access to novel agents in pediatrics than we have before. And so I think pausing and recognizing that is super important. I think two things. One is I will give a shout out to Seattle Genetics, which is now CGen. Two things. They have led the way with us in funding really good on therapy, toxicity, patient reported outcome research, and not just efficacy in terms of disease response. And the reason that's important is as we think about cost effectiveness of taking some of these more novel agents globally, it's not just how well did a disease respond, it's toxicity, it's what late effects they're going to have. So we can think of the cost effectiveness and the cost benefit ratio of really scaling up and saying, okay, this agent is 10% more effective and it decreases both short and long-term toxicities by X. Because there are new agents all the time. Sometimes we like using new agents because it's novel, it's different, but when the efficacy is equivalent, we need a different thing. So if patients survive longer with less side effects, those are different cost benefit ratios that we can use to justify a price tag. So one, thank you for funding that. It's super important. And it's very important as we think about global application of drugs with a higher price tag. And then the second is drugs are really expensive. And I think in countries where, we need to support the drug research that went into the formulation of a drug and those trials. But once they're off trial and we've shown significant benefit, things like standard of care written into a guideline, maybe how do we start focusing on supporting those drugs that are proven and that are standard of care and make those available at a lower cost? I think that's a novel way NCCN could partner with that. We don't need every drug available for everybody, but we do need the most effective ones that are proven, that have great trial data to support that. And so maybe trying to pare down and trying to get increased support and access for the most effective ones that we've proven that are on the market today.
Well, thank you. Turning to you, Ms. Mendez, insights and experiences that you can share.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to say that for my side things is that investing in childhood cancer is investing in the future, right? There are studies by Lancet that says that for every $1 you invest in childhood cancer, if the kid survives, it will be for every $1, he or she will create $3 of income for the country. So it's the return of investment for every dollar is just $3. Children with cancer have a future, have long lives beyond them, and there's a lot to contribute. So I think that's very important to focus on childhood cancer. And I want to say that also it could be sometimes Dr. Fletcher was talking about how expensive treatments and medications are, and if pharmaceutical companies could invest in the early detection or creating awareness of early signs of possible cancers, that is much cheaper in educating the population, educating the community on how to have an early diagnosis of children. That is less expensive than, of course, having to support or fund the treatment for this child. We know that in Latin America, one of the highest problems is that kids get diagnosed when it's too late, when they're in stage 3 or 4, sometimes only palliative care is the option, right? But if they were diagnosed earlier, so that would be much cheaper for the country, for the state. So I would say that investing in creating awareness of the early signs of that could detect cancer would be very, very efficient in order to improve the quality of life and survival rates in Latin America and in other low medium income countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, you've emphasized that beyond the ethical and the humanistic imperative, there are economic returns that going to be manifested down the line. Ms. Nair, how about suggestions or insights that you could share from your unique perspectives?
Yeah, I'm grateful to Alejandra for bringing up the economic part, because this is one of the things that we also emphasize in India. Because at 50,000 to 60,000 new kids diagnosed every year is a considerable number of youth that will be contributing to the country at some point. But we also understand that for a country like India, with the kind of population that we have, a non-communicable disease with such a small number of children will never be a priority, at least not in the near future. That also we understand. But one thing that is going good for us is the low prices for the drugs. The chemo drugs are not expensive at all in India. It's extremely affordable. The support therapy drugs, the antibiotics are slightly more expensive. Right now, the only things that are very expensive and out of reach for the parents are the immunotherapy drugs, because those are not produced in India yet, and it's all coming from other developed countries, and those are definitely not affordable right now. But something that technology brought into this field is a crowdfunding. So 5 years before, an NGO like ours would have never even dreamt of supporting an immunotherapy program. But now we very, very easily raise that amount through crowdfunding. I can't even imagine actually doing this 5 years back. So all the immunotherapy programs are funded through crowdfunding, and instead of the parents doing it, we take the initiative and we do it. We still have a lot of problems with the quality of drugs, because the government is not bringing in the quality control that strictly. It's happening. We might get there in another 10 or 15 years, but we right now have a problem with the quality of drugs. But otherwise, on the side of the drugs, India is not doing badly. Actually, we are good on that side.
Thank you so much. Here's a question from the audience, and I'm going to direct this to Ms. Mendez and Ms. Nair. Recognizing that there are guidelines, and Dr. Carlson talked about the fact that NCCN has patient guidelines. But we recognize that there's a broad range of understanding, and also that in unique areas, Dr. Marco talked a little bit about this, about the unique cultural and behavioral aspects of care. For you, Ms. Mendez and Ms. Nair, how do you use, if you do, cultural and behavioral translations of the evidence and of the suggestions in approaching parents and youth in your country, and to assure greater compliance? What framework do you use for knowledge mobilization, if you will? So maybe start with you, Ms. Mendez.
Yeah, here in Latam countries, first in the whole continent, we have the advantage that we share one language, right? And our countries are different, but we all face similar issues. We're just facing similar issues. So we think that, if I understood right your question, we don't need to reinvent the wheel for each situation in each country. And I'm talking about the NGOs or the social organizations, that we really need to team up and work together with the medical, with the hospitals, medical, and with the state, right? So we have actually established a program here in Latin America called Enlace, which means bonding in English, where we share successful experiences, successful models. We share them among countries that are facing similar realities, that they need to be adapted in terms of cultural things. But basically, we have established this framework for sharing successful models, successful knowledge, successful programs between our countries. So what we have established is that since the NGOs, or the civil society needs to be strong, because it's important to mention that in low medium income countries, the states, we do have a limited resources. So childhood cancer is not a priority for the states. They would prioritize other diseases that have a high impact in dealing with that are like malaria or infectious diseases, that are much cheaper to treat and have a bigger impact, right? So social society, civil society like NGOs, we need to be strong. We need to work together. So what I was telling before is that we have developed a program where being aware how important our role is, need to collaborate, work together, share models, work together in order to improve the quality of life and the survival rates, and other for childhood cancer and their family, kids with childhood cancer and their families, right? So what we do is, like, first we establish an accreditation system for NGOs to achieve certain standards in terms of getting the minimum, like in terms of accountability and transparency. So once the organizations get to a certain standard, then we can share models and interact and create ways of supporting each other throughout the whole continent, right? So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, to a great degree. Thank you so much. Ms. Nair.
Yeah, again, here also India is very different and difficult in the cultural background, because it's more like a continent than a country. So every 300 kilometers, for us, everything changes, from language to culture to everything changes. So to have a cohesive model to work on is very difficult. So one of the things that we do, all the NGOs actually do, is the staff from the respective states. The social worker is from that respective state in that respective hospitals, who will know the cultural nuances of that particular state. And we also have a network of NGOs. We actually have a group where all the NGOs are present. So we collaborate to a great deal. To give an example, an NGO who runs a home away from home need to be much more aware of the cultural differences. than someone who is going to the hospital and helping in the medical treatment part. So we have NGOs working in that field. So we all work together in one hospital. So in one hospital, there'll be like 5 different NGOs working together, supporting different aspects of childhood cancer. There is an NGO for nutritional part. They take care of that all over India. We have a St. Jude, actually, St. Jude Homes, actually, which has a network of homes, very high quality homes across India. So we all concentrate on our own specific areas and work together collaboratively. And we train our social workers very well not to hurt the cultural heritage of anyone that could, and religion also plays an extremely big role in everything. So that also we have to be very careful, actually, not to hurt, but to guide them towards a proper treatment instead of going into other kind of treatments, which also happen to a great deal in India, actually. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you both have raised some very important issues that, patients are not one size fits all. I mean, we find that, even in, developed countries and in the United States, we've recognized that to address diversity, inclusiveness, disparities, we have to approach people differently to identify what the touch points are that are meaningful to them. If I may transition, this is a question for all of you. We touch a lot on cancer treatment, clinical trials, but if all this is successful, we're going to have a lot more survivors. And that's obviously, we want to turn cancer patients into cancer survivors. So within your countries or your regions, and I would also ask Dr. Falagi to chime in with your experience with the St. Jude's global program. What is the amount of support, psychosocial, educational support for cancer survivors and caregivers? And how do you continue to advocate for those needs beyond, if you will, the diagnosis and treatment? So maybe I'll come back to Dr. Amwako.
Thank you. There is good support, in my opinion, in my country. We have a parent support group, and even during treatment, most of them are being trained in bead making and other things that they can do to sort of for other sources of income. Unfortunately, most of the people who present would live below the poverty line or just around that. And so during treatments, most of the parents or caregivers are taught other crafts so that they can use it to earn income. We don't have so many survivors, unfortunately, but the few that we have sort of have a group, and then they meet from time to time. We have a few of them who are advocates that are championing cancer care right now, cancer treatment, are advocating that patients stay in cancer treatment. And whenever we have programs, they do come around and then meet up with children who are still in the program to make them understand that they can be like them one day. And we also, some of the crafts are learned by the children. And during treatment, we make sure that we have a teacher present on the ward or at the daycare, so that even though they're missing school, they don't miss everything. And by the time they're done with treatment, they don't have so much to miss. Thankfully and hopefully, when we have more of the cancers covered by the National Health Insurance, it's going to reduce this burden on the pockets of the parents. And so in the long run, these children who will survive will end up being okay, like financially okay, and we're able to go on with their lives. Thank you.
Turning this over to Dr. Falagi, I know you're not based there, but you certainly have great experiences in global pediatric cancer. You mentioned about the ARIA program, which, in my understanding, has focused on management of individual cancer types in a resource adapted way. How much does it deal with survivorship and all the other supportive care elements that are such an important part of integrating these individuals into society and being valuable, productive members?
Yeah, I'd love to comment on this. And then if Ms. Nair has a comment too, I know she's part of the ARIA guidelines herself as a representative, but I think two things come up. One, just speaking to the question you asked, and in terms of the ARIA guidelines, psychosocial support for patients along the way is sort of lacking globally. The pandemic just showed us how much more we need to support patients and families. One interesting fact is, so I spent a lot of time at our partner site in Guatemala, and the patients are the same. They worry about losing their hair. They have all the same psychosocial issues that everybody does. So support groups and other things for our patients are incredibly important. The guidelines in step one is really focusing on how do we get a patient in the door, early detection, and how do we treat them best? And the guideline is focused on staging and treating them best, making sure the diagnosis is accurate, they're put in the appropriate stage to get what they need, but not extra therapy all the way through. Survivorship is sort of layer two. So we have to get them to survivorhood before we can get them into survivorship. And it is certainly a sort of next step effort. We have tried really hard to follow some long-term care survivorship guidelines established already in the US, because most of those are based off what drugs you got. And so you can easily adapt them to whatever the adapted guideline is. If you got drug X at this much, then this is what you need to follow that. And so survivorship is sort of piece two. Getting them in the door and curing them first is definitely still the main focus. But I anticipate with years to come that piece will grow and grow as we literally have more survivors. And it's one of the, I'm saying cost effective a couple times today, but it's a reason why our cost effectiveness analyses of our strategies at St. Jude are important. We collect a lot of data points on survivors, and it is crystal clear that all of those are not needed to successfully manage patients after therapy. So we need to be thoughtful and look at a battery of labs, what ones made a difference. With echoes, oh, it turns out under a certain dose for an anthracycline that affects the heart, those echoes never showed a change. So again, starting to look at cost effectiveness of when all tests are done and where is the money best spent to help actually increase the quality of life our survivors have after. But to me, that's still been our next step, although Ms. Nair might have other thoughts about that as well through her involvement.
Thank you. Ms.
Yeah,
Mendez,
actually,
I would, sorry.
Yeah, Mr. I'm sorry. You had shared a very touching story of your child being a cancer survivor and thankfully doing well. And your inspiration from that to provide support for other patients. And so lessons learned in terms of survivorship and what other supportive aspects can you bring to the patient survivor and to caregivers?
Yes, I would like to add on what Dr. Flair was just saying. I totally agree. But here in Latin America, we have done an extensive studies and research. We just established the first network of childhood cancer survivors in Latin America. And you know that we found out that they know about their diagnosis, but they're unaware of the specific treatment received. So they have no idea of the late effects and risks of the treatment in the long term. So I think that education is super important. We as parents, I'm going to talk about, you receive the information from the doctors and you sign all the papers. The kid is 6, 7, 12. So when he becomes a survivor, an adult or a young adult, he needs to be educated on what kind of treatment he or she had, of the possible effects. So they need to know who to follow up for the rest of the years. And so we have found out a lot about this, of educating. You ask in Latin America, at least you ask survivors, and they can say, okay, I had leukemia, I had this kind of, sarcoma, but they are unaware of what kind of drugs they received. And we think it's super important that they are totally aware of the special or the side effects that they may develop even many years after finishing treatment. And also there are many late psychological effects that may come up later in life. So I think it's very important for them to be aware of that, to know that it may or may not happen. We believe that many of these conditions, physical conditions and mental health conditions, can be prevented, can be reversed or delayed if the survivors are educated in the subject, right? And also we'll find out how important it is for survivors to meet peers when they are young adults or adults, to meet people who have had similar experiences. So the network that we established in Latam is currently working in raising awareness of the importance of being responsible of their own health, to manage the minimal knowledge about it and understand the specific risks that may derive from the treatment, making campaigns in understanding the importance of self-care and the prevention and hopefully delay of the appearance of late effects, and also understand their complete medical information so they can serve as a guide for future consultation. I know that in developed countries, you have like a passport or something which includes all the information, right? My son was treated outside of the country. I was lucky enough to treat him overseas, and we as a family received all the information in books and electronic information. But here in Chile and in most underdeveloped or developing countries, you just you finish treatment, last day of chemo, and that's all you need, that's all you have. So we're really working now on creating some kind of package of information to be transferred from the parents to the kids who will eventually be young adult survivors.
Well, thank you. That's a great expose. You mentioned something about a passport to be able to empower patients and survivors to know what has happened. I will share a little vignette. Early in the Ukrainian conflict, there was a call for NCCN to help provide patient information guidelines. So NCCN actually came up with 15 patient booklets so that patients who were displaced, either within the country or outside the country, could use those information booklets to understand at least where they were in their treatment, to at least address perhaps one of the barriers to continuing care. In many cases, they were required to resume care somewhere else. So thank you for bringing up the thought of information that can be generalized and reportable. Ms. Nair, how about your thoughts here?
The Global Health Network group that Alejandra and I co-chair actually originated from an original study that was done in 9 developing countries, and I was part of that study. So all the continents were represented except Oceania. And so this is the patient family stakeholder engagement during the treatment. So all the participants were post-treatment kids, actually adults who have become adults now. If it is still a child, a family member participated. And it was very interesting. It was an independent study conducted in different countries. And when we shared the data together, that was in Lyon actually, we were surprised that on the top of the list of the problems was communication and information. Everyone complained that they didn't have enough information. There was no communication between the parents and the healthcare professionals in the hospital. This was in each country, this was the same. The low middle income countries, this was the problem. Whereas I believe, and the study was spearheaded by Dr. Julia Chellenor. And when we actually examined the similar kind of studies in the developed countries, communication and information was at the bottom of the list. That was not anywhere near the problems that they faced. So this all translates into what Alejandra said. They actually go through the entire experience without having enough information about what they are going through. That's really bad, actually. So I'm in the perspective of ARIA, I'm actually looking forward to the guidelines ARIA will bring in the palliative care, in the nursing care, in the psychosocial support care. I'm just looking forward to that. And because so far, whatever I have seen is very impressive. I know that this is not the first resource adapted guidelines that have come out, but how detailed it is. I'm actually quite impressed with the website. So I'm hoping that there'll be a lot of information, very stratified information, which everyone can access, and that will be really good. And in India, the problem with information is it's the disparity that is reflected in everything is even reflected in the information also. That is, if you go to a private hospital, you will be pampered, you will be given all the information you are needed. But in a government hospital, it's the doctors are always overloaded with the number of patients, actually. To give you a perspective of the number of patients in a government hospital, in a big government hospital, could be the total number of childhood cancer cases in a Scandinavian country. If it is 600 or 700, that could be 2 days OP in a government hospital in India. So the doctors don't have time to sit and talk to every patient for half an hour or 45 minutes. They don't have the time. They have too much to deal with. So NGOs like us try to bridge that gap. Once the doctor finishes, and then the social worker takes over and give the information that is needed. And major part of our work is empowering the parents, actually, in terms of knowledge. Yeah.
Well, thank you. You've raised a really important, raised multiple important issues about information, knowledge, and understanding. I mean, that is true even in developed countries, right? However, you do point out something, and this is a question that I'd like to ask each of you. There's sometimes the feeling that all that information has to be dispensed at the first visit, or else you don't get to it anymore. And you talked about the fact that clinicians are busy. Within your systems, how have you been able to help promote or advocate processes that will allow for patients to come back and ask for more information? We know that many patients are overwhelmed at the first visit. So are there processes? You talk about social worker. We recognize how complex the cancer management system is. How about patient navigation? So what have you all been able to help promote or advocate for in terms of policy and coverage in each of your respective areas? I'm going to go in reverse order, alphabetical order. So I'm going to start with Ms. Nair this time. Thank you.
The counseling is an ongoing process. The first day, whatever we say, just go over their head. Nothing goes in, actually. So the very next day, they start coming back with more questions and more doubts and all that. So it's an ongoing process. It takes at least a month for them to settle down and understand a little bit of what is going on with their children. So our social workers are kind of like always available. And the phone numbers are also given if they're not admitted in the hospital, because there is an access to someone who will listen. So that is the first thing that we make them understand, that there's someone who is here ready to hold your hand and walk with you through your journey of cancer. So that person is always available and accessible. So in bigger centers, we have multiple social workers. It's not just one person. There'll be someone in the OP, there'll be 2-3 people in the wards. It could be from other NGOs also, but the support system is given. And the social worker also keeps a diary for follow-ups, so that she or he will know when each child is supposed to come back. So even before they come back, the social worker calls up, talks to the parents, make sure that the parent will be bringing the child back. So because they don't understand the importance of follow, they don't understand the importance of giving the chemo on the particular day. They might think that if I don't have the bus fare today, I might do it, I can do it next week. So it's a constant prodding and support given by the social workers. So I think the the best thing that we do is to make them understand that we are here for you and you just reach out and we are here. That gives them a lot of courage and hope.
Thank you. Ms. Mendez.
So I just want to go again and say that education is an opportunity that is often missed. And I think that educating parents or caregivers is so important in this matter. We have made a lot of studies here in LATAM, and we have found that when the caregiver, usually it's the mother, but I'll just talk about the caregiver, is informed, is engaged in the treatment, understands what's going on. She's also having psychological or other kind of support. That means she feels embraced. She feels that she's not alone. She felt that content by someone. Then the caregiver, he or she, will pass that to the child. So we have recently focused in really emotionally supporting the caregiver, because we found out that that's much more effective sometimes. So when the child sees that his caregiver, his mother, I would say, is controlled, engaged, feels, that knows, or is not empowered, but knows what's going on. That's how we are passing the kid those emotions, right? And we have even found out that when the caregiver is supported, the kid will react better to the treatment, because he or she will eat better, he or she will sleep better, he or she will do less fever, so that will not delay the treatment, right? So the impact on having an educated or empowered or engaged caregiver is really, really important in getting that kind of support. Yeah, and also we have made a lot of studies in LATAM that this kind of engagement of parents really has reduced their abandonment rates of the treatment. We found that in some countries in Latin America, the first year, up to 30% of children abandon treatment because the caregivers are not fully understanding what's going on, or really, as Bindu was saying, the bus didn't, I don't know, they didn't know where to stay. So because of not being educated. So again, I think that educating is the key for this kind of process and getting parents involved and engaged. And I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think you've really highlighted an important point, the role of the caregiver, which may be even more important with a pediatric patient than an adult patient. We recognize even in adult patients the critical role of the caregiver in continuing to support care, reducing abandonment or termination of treatment. So you've isolated a very, very important issue. That's not just about the patient, but the whole family and the caregivers.
Yes, yes.
Dr. Falagi, any thoughts from yours?
Yes, thank you so much. A couple of things. One, touching on the fact that I think as providers, we do feel like that first time you meet them, you need to tell them everything, and it's just total overload. And also realizing that each patient and family needs something different at a different level. And so really taking that moment to say, where are they? What do they need? And just pausing at that and meeting them there. I think there's a couple very practical things I'd like to share. One, I'm grateful that we've put together the website together.stju.org for two reasons. One, it allows people to go back, patients, families, extended family members, and read as they wish. There's a lot of different options to watch videos. Not everybody can read or wants to read. It's translated into many different languages. And one very important thing that we got from our patients and families is at the bottom of each disease is a timeline. So you can understand, okay, what happens now? What happens next week? What happens in 2 months? How long are we talking? And it's a click button that goes through. And I think compartmentalizing the information in that way allows people to take it in fragmented pieces and focus on what matters today, what happens next week, but then they can look ahead because they're worried about also what happens next year. And so it lets people sort of learn at their own pace and in their own language and in their own way. Again, not everybody can read, and so giving them printed information is not helpful, especially if it's not in their language. So meeting them where they're at and giving them what they need. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is that a tangible thing you can do is break up consent into pieces. So you can consent a patient for just a first phase of therapy. And on some of our long trials, by breaking it up and doing consents along the way for the next phase, allows you to be present with the family at that next phase in the moment. And you don't need to go through 2.5 years of therapy all at once. You can really then focus on that first phase. So just a plug is to break consents into pieces, and that allows you to be more effective in them hearing the thing you need them to hear for that phase. And then we have the benefit of patient navigators. You mentioned this. We didn't always have them, but we do now. And it's a nurse who knows everything about that disease entity and the patient. And with social work and with child life, helps walk them through all of therapy. So if the patient relapses or goes to transplant or wherever they go here, that same patient navigator follows them through their journey. And so it's a constant touch point because patients need different things at different times, and knowing who to ask. And like you mentioned, for abandonment and other things, because they know them so well, they know the things they need to be addressed because they get to know them as a patient and as a person and realize what are their contextual struggles, whether it's finances, time, understanding why it's important to come back. We still have patients here that don't come to the therapy, and we call them and they don't come the next week either. That happens everywhere, and understanding the why, but that takes time. And so I'm grateful that we have resources for somebody who has the time to figure out the why, because everybody loves their kid and of course they want to bring them. But there's real life happening at the same time, and that's true across the globe.
Oh, thank you.
May I add one more point? Yeah, the parent support group helps in a big way, actually. So we have parent support groups in all the hospitals. So the existing parents actually act as the biggest educator to the incoming parents, because no one else can explain it the way they explain it, because we are all empathizing. They have experienced it and experiencing it. So we use them as a great tool and teachers for the incoming parents. Another thing that my NGO does is we actually arrange classes for the parents by the doctors at times when it's not very busy, once in a month or once in 3 months. We teach them to read the blood report, like what exactly it means, what are different values. So they feel much more empowered and engaged with the treatment when we do that. And when we call an radiational oncologist and explain to them what exactly is the radiation, what exactly is their child going through. So we don't allow them to ask specific questions about their child, but general questions about what is radiation, what exactly happens inside that room. That makes them feel relieved and more engaged. So that really works. Thank you.
And thank you so much. And Dr. Amako, from your perspectives, what might you share in this?
Right.
We're
Thank you.
talking broadly about support and family involvement. And there was a question related. I'm sorry to add this to, talking about the absence of social support and how do we engage systems to provide this broader social support.
Right. So in my center, what we do from the first time the patient presents onto the oncology ward is just give them a fair idea why they are on the ward and try to understand what their expectations are and what they know about cancer and what they understand, and then work it from there. So it's not like a one size fits all. It's on a case by case basis, and it's very dependent on their educational background, what they do. You have to make sure, you have to be careful not to cut across board with everybody, because people are very different. We do have handouts that we give. Most of the things are drawn out because, again, not many people might be able to read. In our system, unfortunately, the social support is not the best. We do have people that are available for that, but again, we are working with a system that is barely holding up sometimes. So unfortunately, the nurse and the doctor becomes the social worker. They become everything. We do have child life specialists that helps the children to navigate this. And I mean, just a few years back, colleague and myself actually put together children's books that sort of take them through the conditions, the side effects. Like there's a book titled My Hair, My Pride. So the children, it's like with so many drawings, and we have tried to animate it as well. So the children can, those who can't read, they can watch it and understand that they lose their hair and why they lose it, and that is going to grow back. Again, as has been previously mentioned, having patients who have already been through that kind of treatments are like the best advocates for these patients, and they are able to provide support. We are quite lucky that our family support system sometimes in our setting helps. So we have family members that help these caregivers as they come. And yes, I think as we are advocating for best cancer care, we should not forget the psychosocial aspect, because it's actually what is going to keep your patient in treatment if they have that support. And if the support is not there, you're likely to lose most of your patients to follow up. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take a little bit of a slight tangent here. You know, we've been talking a lot about pediatric cancer care, access, clinical trials, support. Perhaps one area, and NCCN just finished last Friday a policy summit on prevention. And while a lot of pediatric cancers perhaps cannot be, if you will, formally prevented, we do know that there are certain cancers that can be prevented downstream. And Dr. Marco, you mentioned about vaccines. And of course, the thing that comes to mind right away is, you know, HPV vaccination or hepatitis vaccinations. There's things that may not be necessarily linked to pediatric cancers, but have to be incorporated at pediatric ages to be able to affect a good outcome. So I'm going to go back to you, Dr. Marco, about while we're talking about managing cancer, pediatric cancer, how are you also incorporating these preventive strategies for something that you may want to affect 20 years downstream?
Right, thank you. The HPV vaccine is actually something that we advocate for. We advise people to get. Unfortunately, my country is not free. They have to pay for it, and it's not like very cheap. It's something that we are pushing with policymakers and hoping that people can get these vaccines at preteen ages to help prevent cervical cancer in the future. We are lucky that our vaccine program in the country does cover hepatitis. And again, before you're a pediatric oncologist, you're a pediatrician and an advocate. So we are always advocating that people go to vaccination clinics and receive this. Yes, I mean, you mentioned that maybe hepatitis, the prevention of hepatitis might not really affect childhood cancers now, but we actually have seen children who are 10, 12 years with hepatocellular carcinoma from hepatitis B. It's rare, but we've seen quite a number of them. So it's something that we advocate for. And because the cause of is largely not known in most pediatric cancers, I think what we advocate best for is early warning signs, and it's something that we go on and on and on to make sure that people are able to recognize them so they can prevent early for best chance at a good outcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Salagi.
Yeah, I think one of the things Dr. Mwako just said is super important to address. We feel it's our duty to take on HPV and expand the legislation around it and access to this vaccine. St. Jude started the HPV cancer prevention program with a focus on going to Capitol Hill in DC and lobbying for this. all the way through each state that has their own regulations. Dr. Heather Brandt in our survivorship group is now making this a new effort and really expanding policy and expanding free drug access for the first preventable cancer that we have with a vaccination. It's not mandated here. It's still up to patient and parent preference. And yet we have a vaccine that can prevent cancer. HPV is not benign, and those that develop cervical cancer, this is a huge, huge preventable problem globally. And so this is one that speaking to things that are worth it. We need it to be free. We need it to be mandated. Any patient who had cancer can get cancer again, of course. And this is a preventable one. And so we've now made it our mission that every patient who walks through here, if they haven't had the HPV vaccine, we're going to give it to them. But it needs to be free. It needs to be mandated. This is a preventable cancer. And we feel like it's our duty to really help publicize that. There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of politics behind it. We need to remove all that because we can prevent a cancer. And I hope that we can prevent other cancers in the future. But man, we need to prevent the one we can right now everywhere.
Absolutely. Ms. Mendez.
Yeah, I want to add on what Mrs. Amoako and Dr. Flaherty had just said. Unfortunately, childhood cancer cannot be prevented, with the only exception of the HPV that I totally agree with what have been said about just it needs to be mandatory and available to everybody. But for the rest of the childhood cancers, there are no clear causes. So of course, it cannot be prevented. We know it can be cured if treated, right? If treated on time. For me, it's so important, like an early and accurate diagnose. That's the key. So as we all know, the sooner the treatment starts, the higher the chances of success. So we need to be able to clearly communicate what are the early warning signs and symptoms. And again, education. In some Latin American cancers, the disease awareness is so low that most cases will go undiagnosed. I'm sure that in Africa and Asia probably is the same. So for some children, there's a poor care pathway. There's limited, they don't know exactly, they will be referred to one doctor after another. And that means that they takes time that they do not have. So everything will happen too late. And once the cancer gets to stage 4, probably palliative care would be the only option, right? So we can change this with education and awareness. And I just want to briefly share 2 examples. In Ghana, where Dr. Amoako works, I know I've heard about that last year or the year before. They have an early warning signs campaign that they were training frontline health workers to recognize the symptoms of childhood cancer. And if I'm right, that led to a 28% of increase in diagnosis. So just educating and training frontline health workers. That was even despite the pandemic, right? The COVID-19 pandemic. Another example is in Dominican Republic. Well, they have a big campaign that's in Latin America, that they were training preschool teachers and elementary school teachers on these early signs of, of course, a teacher will not diagnose a cancer, but if he or she sees some of these symptoms, he can tell the parents, why don't you take this kid to see a doctor? This may be something big. And with that simple thing of training preschool teachers and elementary school teachers, they will refer the kids to a doctor. And again, the increase in diagnosis was up to 30 or 30-something%. And of course, that will increase survival rates, very, very important. So in concrete, I think that building capacity for diagnostic services at hospitals, it's important. Training frontline health workers or educators, teachers, or caregivers to recognize when they might be present. And of course, supporting the development of the patient referral pathway. So they will not go from one doctor to another, but then will need to be referred to the right doctor. And of course, raising public awareness of these early warning signs and symptoms. So I think, I don't know if that answered the question, but I think those are the key points here.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Nair, any additional insights from your standpoint?
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic in India also. And as an NGO, which is not run by doctors, we advocate it only when the doctors directly ask us to do that. But something that I have noticed is that in the government hospitals where the poor patients come and where the vaccine is free, if the doctor asks them to take it, no questions asked, every parent will take it. The problem is in the private hospitals where they educated rich parents come, where they have 100% and sometimes don't take. So there's not much we can do. We talk to them, sometimes they agree, sometimes they don't. But in case of early diagnosis, what Alejandra said, actually all the NGOs in India do, we educate the pediatricians and the general physicians who work in the villages on how to detect, run awareness campaigns to detect retinoblastoma, even to non-doctors, because it's one of the easiest signs to detect actually, and a sure sign also. And there's also an interesting study that was done in South India. I think it is published in the PubMed. This was, the study was done by the pediatric oncologist. The majority of them said that during the course of their study, that is MBBS, they've never come across a single childhood cancer patient because it's not part of their curriculum. So unless they've studied in a hospital where there's a super specialty department of pediatric oncology, they haven't even seen a child with cancer. So there is no question of them opting for pediatric oncology as a specialty in future. So that was an interesting study. So we do run awareness campaigns for doctors. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. You know, we've raised some challenges, some insights, and I think that the take-home message is that this will require a multi-factorial approach, guidelines that are adapted to the regional needs, research that is more inclusive and reflective of the populations. I would quote Ms. Mendes, education, 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 involving not just the patient, but the caregivers, and as Ms. Nair mentioned, you know, all the supporting issues and addressing people at the space and at the level that they need, rather than thinking of one approach that would fit all. And I want to thank all of you for your leadership in these various aspects of global pediatric cancer health, and also for your advocacy and policy support as we advance pediatric cancer care. So Dr. Emmanuel Moko, Dr. Jamie Falage, Ms. Alejandra Mendez, and Ms. Bindu Nair, thank you so much for your time, for your insights, for your expertise, and most important, for your efforts in advancing this field.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ko. I'm Katie Winkworth-Preshner. I'm the Senior Manager of Global Policy and Strategic Alliances here at NCCN. A sincere thank you to everyone who joined today's webinar. A really special thanks to Dr. Ko, our excellent moderator, as well as all of our exceptional speakers for really sharing your insights and expertise on these important topics. You know, throughout the session, I was really humbled by the wonderful advocacy work of all our speakers to really bridge the gap to improving outcomes for pediatric patients worldwide. I would also like to thank all the supporters of the webinar series. Again, without your support, today would not have been possible. It's really a team effort to host these webinars, so a huge thank you to the entire NCCN staff for helping to organize this event, but especially Matt Izzo, Mike Abrams, Mark Geisler, and Liz Reeder for all their work behind the scenes to really make this webinar series a success. If you missed any of our previous webinars in the series, they will all be posted on nccn.org/global policy very shortly. I'm excited to announce our topics for next year. They will focus on the utility and value of national cancer control plans across the economic spectrum, as well as non-medical influences and barriers to accessing high-quality cancer care globally. Please be on the lookout over the next couple months for more information on how to get registered. Thank you again. Continue to stay safe and have a good afternoon or a good evening. Bye.